Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Daniel's apartment, a cramped third-floor walk-up on a quiet side street, barely reflected the refined persona he often tried to project. It was cluttered with papers, old receipts, and a haphazard collection of items he used in his various schemes: business cards from half a dozen made-up companies, lock-picking tools, and a few fake IDs. He was 33, though his perpetual smirk and lively brown eyes sometimes gave the impression of someone younger. He had an athletic build, a product of running from security guards and performing the occasional rooftop escape when things went sideways. He'd always been a con artist, moving from one job to the next. He had mastered the art of reading people quickly, their weaknesses, their desires, their fantasies. Exploiting them was second nature, and he generally operated with an unnerving calm. But as time went on, his aspirations grew. He found himself bored with petty theft and fake checks. He wanted something bigger, something that would test his skills and perhaps finally allow him to retire from the endless cycle of low-stake cons. For weeks, he had been scouting his next opportunity, and that meant tracking the wealthiest social circles in the city. The plan was still taking shape in his mind when a chance discovery catapulted him in a direction he'd never imagined. One late afternoon, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from a contact named Rudy, a friend whose morals were just as flexible as Daniel's. Rudy claimed to have access to a peculiar invention, a high-tech piece of wearable technology that could change everything about one's appearance, allegedly down to fingerprints and eye color. It sounded unbelievable, but Rudy swore by its authenticity. Sensing a possibility for a high-level con, Daniel agreed to meet at a rundown garage near the industrial outskirts of town. The building had peeling paint, rusted steel doors, and an air of abandonment that made Daniel glance over his shoulder every few seconds. Inside, Rudy stood by a folding table illuminated by a single overhead lamp. On that table rested a strange, full-body garment, translucent and finely detailed with realistic facial features. It was uncanny. The suit looked disturbingly similar to a real person's body. Rudy explained the technology in whispered excitement. Advanced synthetic materials, microsensors, and an internal structure that matched human musculature. You stepped into it, sealed it around yourself, and in moments you appeared to be a different person. The sample in front of Daniel had the distinct face of a woman with strong cheekbones, soft lips, and eyes that suggested confidence. "What is that face supposed to be?" Daniel asked, trying to mask his fascination with casual indifference. Rudy shrugged. "She's someone named Vanessa Holborn, wealthy apparently. I don't ask too many questions about how they got the source material, and you shouldn't either. Point is, you put it on, and you look exactly like her." Daniel circled the table, running his fingertips along the edges of the strange suit. The craftsmanship was beyond anything he'd seen in stage makeup or prosthetics. It was smooth to the touch, and the coloration seemed so lifelike that part of his mind balked at the ethics of the entire thing. He cleared his throat. "You're sure this works?" Rudy nodded, leaning closer. "I tested a different model once. Turned me into a completely different man for a couple of hours. You wouldn't believe how seamless it was. No lumps, no weird seams. And the best part, the sensors replicate your own expressions. You raise an eyebrow, the suit does it. You smile, the suit smiles." Daniel's scheming mind kicked into high gear. He had spent the last few weeks researching an exclusive gala that would be happening soon. The event's organizer was Charlotte Desmond, known for her impeccable taste and philanthropic connections. It was rumored that the guest list included celebrities, business moguls, and old money aristocrats. All the right ingredients for a big score. But gaining entry required more than a nice tuxedo. It demanded a certain social standing and connections that Daniel, an uninvited nobody, simply did not possess. Looking back at the strange garment, Daniel asked, "You said the woman's name is Vanessa Holborn?" "Yeah," Rudy replied. "Wealthy, travels a lot, attends high society events here and abroad. If you could pass as her, you'd have access to some very lucrative circles." Daniel's eyes flashed with excitement. "How much do you want for it?" They negotiated a steep price, and Daniel parted with a significant chunk of his savings to secure the skin suit. The investment was substantial, but he felt it was worth it. A transformation of this magnitude could open doors that were previously sealed shut. He thanked Rudy, folded the suit into a black duffel bag, and headed back to his apartment, his mind already racing with ideas. That night, surrounded by the usual clutter of the living room, Daniel locked the door and unzipped the duffel bag. He spread the skin suit out on the table, the overhead light casting a faint sheen on the synthetic material. He hesitated. Crossdressing was new territory for him. In previous cons, he'd assumed disguises as various men, but never a woman. The concept had always seemed complicated. Different mannerisms, different wardrobe, different sets of expectations. Yet the payoff could be enormous. If this suit was as realistic as Rudy claimed, Daniel might pull off something unprecedented. He took a deep breath and began putting it on, 1 foot at a time, then pulling it up around his torso. The sensation was both chilling and mesmerizing. It clung to his skin, somehow resizing itself. When he slipped his arms through, the sleeves tightened, smoothing out any wrinkles, and in seconds he saw slender hands with manicured nails instead of his own. He carefully lifted the suit over his head and adjusted the opening around his neck. The final part was aligning the face over his, ensuring the microsensors linked up. A slight hissing sound surrounded him as the suit sealed, then the pressure subsided. When he glanced into the full-length mirror by the couch, he nearly jumped. He was staring at a tall, elegant woman with a poised posture. The reflection matched every detail he'd expect from a high society figure. Toned arms, graceful shoulders, and the refined face of someone who had grown up with wealth. He exhaled and saw the reflection do the same, the lips parting gently. Even the subtle way the shoulders moved felt natural. Slowly, he walked around the apartment, testing the suit's range of motion. The transformation was so complete that he barely recognized the shadow he cast on the wall. His voice, however, was still his own. Rudy had mentioned an included voice modulator, an additional piece that tucked against the throat. Daniel tried it on, fumbling a bit before feeling it click into place. When he cleared his throat, the next words out of his mouth came as a refined alto. Shocked, he spoke again. "This is incredible," he said, pausing to note how elegantly the voice carried. He spent the next hour acclimating to the suit. He practiced walking in heels he'd borrowed from a friend's closet during a previous con. He'd never found a use for them until now. It was far from easy, but he was determined. All the while, the reflection in the mirror became more convincing. At a certain point, he gently touched his new cheek and felt the warmth transferred through the material. It wasn't just a disguise. It was an entirely new identity. The next day, Daniel researched Vanessa Holborn. He discovered that she was indeed well known in elite circles, owning a lavish penthouse in the city and a villa in the south of France. She was on the guest list for the upcoming gala. That alone was worth every cent he'd paid for the suit. Any security check or invitation scrutiny would instantly disappear if he showed up as her. All he needed was a plan to carry out a heist worthy of this flawless disguise. The gala in question took place at the Lockwood Hotel, an ornate building famous for its grand ballroom. The theme of the night would be an auction of prized artwork and rare collectibles, all under the watchful eye of Charlotte Desmond, the event's organizer. Attendees would be wearing their finest gowns, jewels, and accessories. A perfect environment for a con artist looking to relieve unsuspecting guests of their valuables. For several days, Daniel worked tirelessly, forging invites and cross-checking the real Vanessa's usual style. He stocked up on sophisticated dresses, shoes, and makeup to match her typical look. He arranged to have one of Vanessa's signature designer dresses delivered to a temporary address, forging her signature along the way. Every detail, down to the shade of her lipstick, had to be perfect. He knew that in that world, a single misstep could shatter the illusion. When the night of the gala arrived, Daniel dressed carefully in the suit, then slipped into the long, midnight blue gown. The fabric felt luxurious against the suit's surface, and the stiletto heels gave him a confidence-boosting height. He took a taxi to the Lockwood, stepping out onto the red carpet as photographers snapped pictures. He felt a ripple of adrenaline. This was the moment. He walked past security with a soft smile, produced the invitation, and was promptly allowed inside. No one batted an eye. The lobby was breathtaking. Marble floors, gold-trimmed columns, chandeliers that sparkled with hundreds of tiny crystals. Daniel glided across the floor, conscious of every step, and then he saw Charlotte for the first time. She stood near the entrance to the ballroom, greeting guests with a cordial handshake and a disarming smile. She looked to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pinned in an elegant twist. She wore a sleek black gown with silver earrings that caught the light. In her presence, people seemed to gravitate toward her, as if her poise and genuine warmth were magnetic. Stepping forward, Daniel smiled. Charlotte extended her hand. "Vanessa Holborn," Charlotte said, a note of delight in her voice. "I'm so glad you could make it. It's an honor to have you here." Daniel, trying to mimic the gracious manner he imagined Vanessa to have, offered a polite nod. "Thank you for inviting me, Charlotte. I've heard so much about your events." Charlotte's eyes lit up. "I hope we live up to your expectations. We have a wonderful auction planned, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the presentations we have scheduled." Their conversation lasted only a moment, but Daniel felt a spark. He'd met many people in such gatherings, some vain, some pompous, but Charlotte had a warmth that left him briefly off balance. After stepping away, he tried to refocus on the plan. He was here for the spectacular emerald necklace to be displayed before the auction, an heirloom rumored to be valued in the millions. Stealing it quietly would require cunning and perfect timing. Inside the ballroom, candlelight illuminated round tables dressed in fine linens. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried silver trays of champagne flutes. The hum of polite chatter and the clinking of glassware created a refined ambiance. Daniel navigated the crowd, greeting acquaintances of the real Vanessa, whose names he had memorized. Each time, he was relieved to see that no one questioned his identity. His manner of speaking, the carefully studied posture, and the confidence of his stride all made it appear seamless. The emerald necklace was perched on a small pedestal in a glass display case at the side of the stage, guarded by a single uniformed officer and a thick plexiglass shield. Security cameras pointed in that direction. Daniel didn't intend to make a scene. The plan was subtler: create a distraction while the necklace was in transit from the display to the auction area. If he could intercept it, slip it into a hidden pouch sewn into his dress, and then vanish into the night, he'd be set for life. He took a few minutes to find the perfect vantage point. While scanning the room, he caught Charlotte's gaze from across the crowd. She offered a gentle wave, a slight tilt of her head. He waved back reflexively, feeling a twinge of guilt. Beneath the charming exterior he'd manufactured, he was only here to commit a crime. But he pushed that thought away. He had spent too long in this line of work to let sentiment derail a well-crafted scheme. As the evening wore on, Charlotte made her way to Daniel's table. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked. "Not at all," Daniel said, sliding one of the chairs back slightly. Charlotte settled in, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I have to admit, Ms. Holborn, I was surprised when I saw your name on the guest list. I've heard a lot about you, your philanthropic work, your sense of style. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Daniel felt his stomach knot slightly. He knew from his research that Vanessa occasionally funded charities and owned an art gallery. He hoped he could replicate her charitable persona convincingly. "The pleasure is all mine," he replied with what he hoped was a modest smile. "You've organized quite the soiree." She laughed softly. "Thank you. It's been quite hectic, but seeing everyone enjoying themselves makes it worthwhile. Actually, I wanted to personally invite you to a smaller reception after the auction. Just a few close friends and organizers to celebrate the success of the event." Daniel froze inwardly. This was unexpected. "Oh? I wasn't aware there was an after-party." "It's very informal," Charlotte said, her voice sincere. "I think it would be wonderful to talk more, especially about the possibility of collaborating on future events." She paused, studying Daniel's face. "That is, if you're not too tired after the main auction." In that moment, Daniel realized that going to a more intimate gathering posed a risk. The more time he spent in close quarters with Charlotte and her associates, the more opportunities existed for something to go wrong. Yet, he found himself strangely drawn to her, and from a purely strategic standpoint, mingling in the circle of organizers might grant him inside information on the best time to make a move for the emerald necklace. "I'd be delighted," he said, forcing a calm he didn't entirely feel. Charlotte gave a warm smile that reached her eyes, then stood. "Excellent. I'll have someone pass along the details to you shortly." He watched her walk off to greet other guests, feeling a flutter he hadn't expected. Usually, at events like this, he kept his guard up, but something about Charlotte's kindness made him momentarily forget his mission. With a resolute shake of his head, he reminded himself that he was a con artist here to do a job. Any stray emotional entanglement could jeopardize the entire operation. Shortly before the auction began, Daniel made his move. He slipped away from the main ballroom, timing his departure to coincide with a speech on stage that kept everyone's attention. The hallway beyond was quiet. He knew that the staff would soon be transferring the emerald necklace from the display case to the stage, where it would be showcased before bidding. Daniel had already identified a service corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway. That corridor, typically used by staff bringing out trays of food, would be the perfect route for intercepting the necklace. He found a small alcove behind a decorative curtain and waited, heart pounding. After several minutes, 2 event staff emerged, escorted by a single guard. They carried the necklace in a velvet-lined box. The guard, somewhat distracted by radio chatter about an unimportant security glitch on the other side of the building, seemed less alert than he should have been. Daniel slipped behind them as they headed into the service corridor. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit. The staff members walked briskly, the guard trailing behind. Daniel waited until they were almost at the corridor's end. Then he created the diversion. A small preset device in his purse that, once triggered, caused a minor fuse overload in the nearest electrical panel. Lights flickered, and the alarm system let out a shrill beep before going silent. Confused, the guard told the 2 staffers to wait while he checked the panel around the corner. As soon as the guard disappeared, Daniel acted. He approached, speaking in the refined voice he'd practiced. "Excuse me," he said, affecting a sense of authority. "Charlotte sent me. She wants the necklace brought to the main stage immediately. She's concerned about the power issue." The staffers looked at one another uncertainly. "Should we wait for the guard?" one of them asked. Daniel gave a dismissive wave. No need. The guard asked me to take responsibility for now. We don't want to cause a delay. Quickly, this way. With the slight confusion caused by the alarm, the staffers didn't question him further. They handed over the velvet box, presumably trusting Vanessa Holborn, a prominent guest, to be involved in the event's logistics. Daniel felt the weight of it in his hands, the sense of triumph filling his chest. He maintained a neutral expression, ushering the staffers toward a side door that supposedly led back to the main ballroom. As soon as they were out of sight, he ducked into a nearby storage closet. In that closet, he snapped open the velvet box to confirm the necklace was indeed there. The emeralds glowed under the single overhead bulb, each facet shimmering with potential wealth. He carefully transferred the piece into a concealed pocket inside his dress. Closing the empty velvet box, he mentally rehearsed how he would walk out the side exit he had already scouted. Once outside, he would vanish into the city, discard the suit, and slip back into his old life with enough money to never worry about the next con again. Yet as he stood there, the faint hum of music drifting in from the ballroom, he found himself pausing. His thoughts wandered to Charlotte. The sincerity in her eyes, the way she'd taken time to invite him to an after-party, the sense that maybe she was genuinely interested in more than just a professional connection. And he realized that for the first time in his career, he hesitated. Moments ticked by. With a heavy sigh, he stepped out of the storage closet, the precious necklace hidden away. He made for the service exit, pushing the door open cautiously. But something made him stop. He couldn't explain it to himself entirely. Maybe it was curiosity about what it would feel like to be seen in a light that had nothing to do with a con. Or perhaps it was a pang of regret at deceiving someone who seemed genuine. Whatever it was, he let the door fall shut again. He turned and made his way back to the main ballroom. The corridors were dim, and staff members hurried about, trying to reset systems after the minor power glitch. No one paid him any mind. His plan had worked flawlessly, and all he had to do was walk away. Instead, he walked in the opposite direction, back to the glittering banquet tables and well-dressed guests. On stage, the auctioneer was already listing off items. Daniel slipped into the crowd just in time to see Charlotte looking slightly flustered, tapping on her phone. She spotted him and hurried over. "Vanessa, there you are? I was worried when things started glitching with the lights. We've lost track of the necklace for a moment, though I'm sure the staff will sort it out." Daniel caught his breath. If he were to continue the heist as planned, he should feign ignorance, maybe slip away again. But the weight of the emerald necklace pressed against his ribs, and he felt an uncomfortable mix of triumph and guilt. Instead, he reached into the hidden pocket, removed the necklace, and handed it to Charlotte without a word. Her eyes widened in shock. "What? How did you get this?" she asked, voice hushed. Daniel forged a quick explanation. "I spotted some confusion in the corridor and heard that the necklace was misplaced. I intercepted it to make sure it stayed safe. Here, take it to the stage before anyone notices." Charlotte stared at him, relief washing over her features. "Thank goodness," she breathed. "You just saved the evening. The staff must have been in a panic." She held the necklace as though it were a fragile treasure. "I can't tell you how grateful I am. Let me run this up there and we'll talk afterward." Daniel nodded, forcing a tight smile as Charlotte rushed to the stage. He heard the applause that erupted when the precious item was revealed to the audience. He had just given up his ticket to a luxurious life in favor of what exactly? He wasn't entirely sure. But the sudden surge of conflicting emotions left him standing alone while the crowd focused on the auction. The gala drew to a close about an hour later. The items were successfully auctioned off, and the guests began to mingle more casually, enjoying the last round of drinks and desserts. Daniel stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city's skyline. His mind raced with questions. Had he just walked away from the biggest haul of his life? Had he truly given it all up for a moment of conscience? "Vanessa," Charlotte's voice came from behind him. "I've been looking for you everywhere." He turned to face her. She looked both relieved and exhilarated, as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders now that the event had been a success. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. "Yes, of course," Daniel replied in his borrowed voice. "Just needed a moment to breathe." Charlotte gestured toward a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the main crowd. "I can't thank you enough for rescuing the necklace situation. We could have had a massive scandal on our hands. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please let me know." Daniel swallowed. He was no stranger to manipulating gratitude for personal gain. But in that instance, he found himself at a loss for words. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said, though he knew better than anyone that wasn't true. She pressed her lips together, studying him carefully. "I know we have the after-party for close friends and staff, but would you consider having a late dinner or coffee with me another night? I'd love to discuss some ideas I have, and also, I'd just like to get to know you better." Daniel felt a flutter again, a mix of excitement and dread. He realized that continuing this ruse would only deepen the complications, but he also recognized a rare chance to step away from his usual path. Something about Charlotte's earnestness made him want to see where a conversation could lead. He nodded. "I'd like that." Her face brightened. She retrieved a small card from her handbag, scribbled on the back, and handed it over. "That's my personal number. Call me anytime." He accepted the card, the weight of his deception pressing down. This was uncharted territory. He had never formed a genuine connection while in disguise, and he didn't fully understand why Charlotte's invitation felt so significant. Yet he also had a sense that in handing back that necklace, he might have chosen a path that offered more than the usual outcome for a con artist. "Shall we go join the others at the after-party?" Charlotte asked. Daniel hesitated. If he left now, he might still have a chance to slip away without raising suspicion, to vanish before the real Vanessa ever returned to town. But instead, he found himself saying, "Yes, let's." They moved through the grand corridors to a more intimate lounge at the top floor of the hotel. The after-party had a subdued atmosphere. Candles flickered on small tables, and a soft jazz trio played in the corner. About 30 people milled around, sipping cocktails, congratulating each other on a successful night. Charlotte introduced Daniel to a handful of them, board members, prominent benefactors, and a couple of local celebrities. Everyone treated Vanessa Holburn with respect and a hint of awe, as though her mere presence elevated the event's status. Daniel played the part flawlessly, or so he thought. He made polite conversation, discussed high-end art and philanthropic ventures, all gleaned from the research he'd done before the gala. Still, he felt increasingly torn. In a sea of refined talk and polished mannerisms, Charlotte's authenticity stood out like a beacon. She laughed openly, listened attentively, and seemed genuinely kind to everyone in the room, whether they were VIPs or catering staff. As the night wore on, she and Daniel found themselves talking quietly on a plush couch in the corner of the lounge. The music was faint in the background, overshadowed by the gentle hum of conversation. She sipped her drink thoughtfully. "Sometimes I wonder," Charlotte said, her gaze drifting over the room, "if all these galas, auctions, and fancy get-togethers really do as much good as we hope. I want to believe they do. At the very least, they bring people together for a cause." Daniel's eyes flicked to the floor. There he sat, having come here to steal from those very people she was praising for their contributions. He forced himself to meet her gaze. "I think your passion for these events shows," he managed. "People respond to sincerity." Charlotte smiled, then glanced at the window where the city lights shimmered. "Yes, well, sincerity can be rare in some circles. That's why I try to be mindful of who I am. If I ever become jaded, I'll probably step away and do something else. Daniel's chest felt tight, aware of his own secrets. For the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of remorse for living under false identities. He diverted the topic. So, what's next for you after tonight? Besides collecting your well-deserved accolades, of course. She laughed lightly. I have another fundraising event in a couple of months, but I'm hoping to take a short break first. Maybe travel, see some places I've never been. Where do you call home these days? He froze internally, recalling that Vanessa supposedly had a penthouse in town but traveled extensively. I split my time between here and overseas, he said carefully. But I might stay longer in the city this time. She tilted her head curiously. That's wonderful. If you do, maybe I can show you some parts of town that aren't in the guidebooks. The thought of spending more time with Charlotte in this guise left him both thrilled and uneasy. He had never felt trapped by an alias before, but now it seemed like a precarious balancing act. When the evening finally wound down, Charlotte left with the promise that they would meet again soon. Daniel returned to his apartment in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He carefully removed the skin suit, watching as his reflection morphed back into his normal self. It struck him how foreign his own face looked after a night spent as Vanessa. He folded the suit and placed it in a secure trunk. Then he sank onto his worn couch, the city's neon glow shining through the dusty blinds. He had two options. The first was to vanish, as he always did after a heist or near heist. He could skip town, sell the stolen items, though he'd given the emerald necklace back, and move on to the next big thing. The second option was far riskier. Maintain the guise, keep meeting Charlotte, pretend to be someone else, and see where it led. He told himself he'd decide in the morning, but sleep eluded him. His thoughts circled endlessly, drifting between the memory of Charlotte's laughter and the sense of guilt that he'd almost robbed her event. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to occupy his time with smaller hustles, dummy online auctions, phone scams that barely paid the rent. But none of it satisfied him anymore. He found himself checking the trunk where he kept the skin suit, wondering if it was worth risking exposure just to see Charlotte again. Maybe he could slip out of her life without a trace. She'd probably be hurt or confused, but she'd move on soon enough. Why complicate everything? Yet, one evening, as he sat staring at his phone, he realized he still had Charlotte's card. She had written her personal number and added a small note inviting him, Vanessa, to call any time. Before he fully registered his own actions, he picked up the phone and dialed, speaking in that refined voice. Charlotte answered almost immediately, sounding genuinely happy to hear from her new friend. They made arrangements to meet at an upscale cafe, just the two of them. He arrived early, donning the suit and a stylish ensemble appropriate for a late afternoon outing. The cafe was bright, with large windows overlooking a bustling street. Charlotte waved him over to a table near the window. She ordered a pot of tea, along with pastries, and they chatted about the success of the gala. No mention was made of how the necklace went missing and mysteriously reappeared. Perhaps Charlotte had chosen to let that incident fade into the background. "What brought you here today?" she asked at one point, smiling over her teacup. Daniel blinked, carefully crafting his answer as Vanessa. "I realized I didn't want to lose touch. You impressed me at the gala. I wanted to learn more about the person behind such a grand event." Charlotte's cheeks tinged with a subtle glow. "It's not that grand," she said with a modest laugh. "But I'm flattered. Honestly, I was worried you might be bored with it all. You seem like someone who's seen countless galas, probably bigger and more important than mine." Daniel tilted his head, feigning a thoughtful expression. "It's not about size or importance. It's about the heart behind it." Charlotte regarded him with a look of curiosity. "You surprise me, Vanessa. "You look like the type who has everything you want, but you talk about things with a different perspective." He knew she was seeing glimpses of sincerity. The irony, of course, was that it was the sincerity of someone who didn't actually exist. But as they talked, he found that he did care, at least in that moment. Charlotte had a way of drawing out an earnest side of him he rarely displayed. They strolled out of the cafe after finishing their tea and walked down the street side by side. She pointed out her favorite bookstore, a hidden antique shop, and a small park with a fountain. When the wind picked up, sending a swirl of autumn leaves around them, she instinctively moved closer, as though seeking warmth. By the time they parted ways, dusk was settling over the buildings. Charlotte lingered for a moment, as though reluctant to say goodbye. "I hope this won't be the last time we meet like this," she said softly. Daniel nodded, feeling that surge of conflicting emotions again. "I hope so too," he managed, offering a gentle smile. They exchanged a brief hug, and Daniel noted the warmth of her hand on his shoulder. Before he could question the magnitude of his own choices, he turned away and headed in the opposite direction. When he slipped out of sight, he ducked into an alley and carefully made his way back to his apartment, where he would remove the suit once again. He tried to ignore the nagging realization that every meeting with Charlotte as Vanessa was building a foundation of lies. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent. They visited museums, had lunch at a chic rooftop restaurant, even took a weekend drive out to a winery on the city's outskirts, talking about everything from art to current events. Daniel found himself dangerously immersed in the persona of Vanessa Holburn. To maintain the illusion, he had to keep up with a new range of social engagements, phone calls, and sometimes even short-term travel plans that matched Vanessa's known lifestyle. It was exhausting, but somehow exhilarating. A pivotal moment came one evening when Charlotte confided in him about her family. They were old money, but she had chosen to strike out on her own rather than rely on an inheritance. Daniel admired her conviction, though he didn't say so directly. She also confessed that she'd been disappointed in relationships before, typically meeting individuals who were enamored with her social standing rather than her as a person. Her eyes glistened as she spoke, and Daniel sensed a real vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. He listened quietly, aware that he was deceiving her far more than any of her past suitors. After she finished, she sighed, leaning her head back against the seat of his rented car. "I'm sorry. That was probably too much to dump on you," she murmured. Daniel shook his head. "Not at all," he said in a voice that had grown more natural with every passing day in the suite. "I appreciate you trusting me enough to share." The tension in the small space felt tangible. Charlotte reached out and lightly touched his hand. Their eyes locked, and there was a moment of quiet intensity. He thought for a second she might lean in for a kiss. Instead, she just gave his hand a gentle squeeze, then withdrew. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Although they didn't talk about it, the moment signaled a shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement that something deeper was growing, and that left Daniel feeling more conflicted than ever. He had built an entire persona to steal from her event, and now he was caught up in a sense of closeness he'd never anticipated. Each night he lay awake, glancing between the trunk that held the skin suit and the faint reflection of himself in the mirror. He was living a double life that grew more impossible to sustain with each passing day. At times he considered telling her the truth, confessing that he wasn't Vanessa Holburn at all, that he was a 33-year-old con artist with a knack for deception. But the thought of her reaction terrified him. He pictured the betrayal in her eyes, the heartbreak, possibly the anger that could lead to him being arrested or worse. The risk seemed too great. Meanwhile, he couldn't fathom continuing to lie to her indefinitely. The conflict tore at him, During one of their dinners at a quiet bistro, Charlotte reached across the table and touched his hand again. "Vanessa, there's something I want to ask you," she began, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I have a charity event in a few weeks. It's at my childhood estate. I'd really love if you could come as my guest of honor. We'll stay overnight, just a small group, so we can prepare for the event the next day." Daniel's stomach tightened. The idea of spending a night in close quarters, presumably where it would be impossible to remove the suit, filled him with dread. But Charlotte's hopeful expression stopped him from declining. "That sounds lovely," he heard himself say, even as his mind screamed at him to back out. Over the following days, Daniel tried to formulate a plan. If he went with her, the risk of discovery soared, but if he refused, he would likely never see her again. In the end, he found himself unable to cut ties. He told himself that he'd figure something out, some ruse to keep from being unmasked. And so, on a cool Friday afternoon, they set off for her family estate in a sleek car. Charlotte drove, chatting excitedly about how beautiful the grounds were in autumn, how she wanted to show him the gardens and the hidden library. When they arrived, the estate was everything Daniel had expected: manicured lawns, a grand fountain, and a sprawling mansion with ivy clinging to stone walls. A few other guests were already there, relaxing on the sun-dappled patio. Charlotte gave Daniel a brief tour of the main floor, then led him to a guest room with a sweeping view of the gardens. The staff had already laid out flowers and fresh towels, treating him like the esteemed guest they believed he was. After dinner that night, Charlotte suggested a walk through the gardens. The sky was clear, revealing a canopy of stars. They strolled along a path lit by quaint lanterns, the scent of roses lingering in the air. Eventually, they paused by a stone bench near a small pond. The water's surface reflected the moonlight, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. Charlotte turned to him, her expression vulnerable. "I'm really happy you came," she murmured. Daniel, in the persona of Vanessa, offered a soft smile. "I wouldn't have missed it," he said, though inside he felt a surge of panic. Time was running out on this illusion. She took a breath as if summoning courage. "Look, I know we haven't known each other for very long, but I feel a real connection with you." She hesitated, as though gauging his reaction. "I haven't felt this comfortable with anyone in a long time. I can't explain why, but I trust you." The admission landed like a blow to Daniel's chest. Every second he continued to let her believe the lie felt like he was stealing something far more precious than any emerald necklace. He considered telling her everything in that moment. The stars above them seemed to bear silent witness as he wrestled with indecision. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Charlotte took his hesitance for surprise and pushed on, her cheeks flushed. I just wanted you to know, in case you feel the same way." Daniel forced himself to exhale. "Charlotte," he began, voice trembling slightly, "I care about you too. A lot. More than I ever thought I would." Her face lit up, and she leaned in, placing a hand gently on his cheek. The impulse to lean into the kiss that seemed imminent battled with his sense of guilt. Finally, he slipped his arms around her, letting her rest against him. Even though the suit separated their skin, the moment felt powerful. They stood like that for what seemed an eternity, enveloped in the quiet hush of the garden. When they pulled apart, Charlotte's eyes glimmered. "I'm glad," she whispered, a slight quaver in her voice. "I was so worried you'd laugh at me or tell me I was reading too much into things." Daniel shook his head, struggling to maintain composure. "Never." They walked back to the mansion in comfortable silence, hand in hand under the moonlit sky. Upon reaching the grand foyer, Charlotte paused. "I should check on the others," she said softly. "There's some last-minute organizing to do. I'll see you in the morning." He nodded and watched her ascend the sweeping staircase. Her silhouette disappeared around a corner, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Night settled over the estate, and Daniel retreated to his guest room, feeling the full weight of his deception. He locked the door, went into the bathroom, and examined his reflection in the mirror. Under the room's soft light, Vanessa's features looked almost real, but he could see the faint edges where the suit met the corners of his eyes. Pulling at the neckline, he felt a wave of panic. If the suit malfunctioned, or if Charlotte walked in unannounced, his cover would be ruined. He sank to the edge of the bathtub, face in his hands. How had he allowed this to happen? He'd come for a heist, and now found himself feeling more trapped by his own conscience than by any security system he'd ever encountered. He barely slept. In the morning, a gentle knock on the door startled him. He quickly adjusted the suit before opening the door to find Charlotte, looking radiant in a simple sweater and jeans. "Good morning," she said with a smile. "Hope you slept well. Breakfast is downstairs if you're hungry." He mumbled something affirmative, aware that his voice modulator still needed to be activated. After fumbling with it in private, he joined her in the dining room, where a few others were already sipping coffee. The conversation revolved around the event they were hosting that night, an intimate charity dinner for a select group of donors. Charlotte teased Daniel gently about wanting him to meet some important community figures. He smiled, managing to make small talk, though inside he was tying himself in knots. That afternoon, as the staff prepared the mansion for the dinner, Daniel knew it was time to make a decision. Either he maintained the ruse indefinitely, or he found a way to come clean. He couldn't continue living a double life under this roof. The risk was too high. But the idea of telling her the truth made his stomach churn. By late afternoon, he slipped outside for some air. The garden paths were empty, giving him a moment to gather his thoughts. And then he saw Charlotte standing near the pond, dressed in a flowing blouse that caught the breeze. She turned, spotting him. "I was looking for you," she said softly. "Everything all right?" Daniel approached, heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but for several seconds, no sound came out. Finally, he said, "Charlotte, there's something I have to tell you." She frowned, concern crossing her features. "You're scaring me. What's going on?" He took a trembling breath. "I'm not who you think I am," he began, reaching up to the collar of the skin suit. She stepped back in alarm as he peeled it slightly, revealing the edge of synthetic material. Before her eyes, the seams separated from his real skin. The shock on her face was immediate and visceral. She looked as though her entire world had just turned upside down. "What the?" she started, voice shaking. "What is this?" He couldn't speak for a moment. When he finally did, his real voice came out, raw and trembling. "I'm sorry," he managed. "My name is Daniel. I'm 33 years old. I'm a con artist. I was never Vanessa Holburn. I was hired to steal an item at your gala." But then he ran out of words, seeing the devastation, confusion, and betrayal ripple across her features. Charlotte's hands trembled. She pressed them to her temples, as though trying to make sense of the surreal sight. "This can't be real," she whispered. "I saw you, talked with you, shared things I never told anyone. Was any of it true?" Daniel's eyes burned with regret. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I was going to rob the event, but then I met you, and—" He paused, struggling. "I tried to walk away from the heist. I did walk away from it. I never went through with it." She stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "You lied to me this entire time. This is—" Her voice broke. "I let myself believe—" She took a shaky step back, as if physically recoiling from him. The look in her eyes was one of profound hurt. The soft breeze rustled the garden plants, the only sound in the tense air. Daniel took a step forward, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Charlotte," he said, voice cracking. "I know this is unforgivable. I wanted to tell you earlier, but—" "But what?" she said, eyes brimming with tears. "You wanted to keep lying until it was convenient to come clean?" Her voice rose, tension emanating from her every word. "I don't even know who you are. This face, this voice. It's all been some elaborate trick. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" He swallowed hard. "I never expected things to get this far. I never expected to feel—" He paused, unable to articulate the swirl of emotions. "I'm sorry." She shook her head, stepping back again. "I can't. This is too much," she whispered. "You need to go, now." Her eyes flitted to the entrance of the garden. "Leave. I can't look at you." He searched for something to say, something that could ease the pain on her face, but every word felt empty. Finally, he bowed his head and turned away. She didn't call after him. He heard her stifle a sob as he walked down the path toward the driveway, removing the suit fully only once he was out of sight. He stuffed it into a bag and hurried to the estate gate, leaving behind the single person who had ever made him question his old life. He found a taxi near the estate's outskirts and directed the driver back to the city. The entire ride, he stared out the window, feeling hollow. His phone vibrated with messages, but he ignored them. He knew he'd likely burned any bridge he had with Charlotte. Part of him considered returning the suit and leaving the city altogether. Maybe he could start fresh somewhere else. But he couldn't shake the memory of the look in Charlotte's eyes. Shock, heartbreak, and betrayal. Back in his dingy apartment, he tossed the suit into a corner. The trunk it had once occupied remained open, and he stared at it as though it were an accursed relic. Daniel sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He thought about how close he'd come to walking away from his old life entirely. Yet, in the end, he'd managed to hurt someone he cared about in the most profound way possible. Days passed. He tried to contact Charlotte, leaving voicemails and sending messages she never answered. He learned from some online news snippet that the charity dinner at her estate had gone off without a hitch, raising a significant sum for a local cause. She hadn't needed him for that. And why would she? Consumed by guilt, he found himself at a crossroads. The same old patterns of scamming and cheating no longer held their usual appeal. He couldn't forget Charlotte's devastated expression. Unsure of what to do next, he ultimately made a decision he never thought possible. He wrote a genuine letter of apology. In it, he explained everything in raw detail: how he'd found the suit, the original plan for the heist, the conflict he felt, and the real feelings he developed for her. He offered no excuses, only an acknowledgement that he owed her the truth, even if it was too late. He sent the letter by courier, not knowing if it would be read or torn up on sight. Afterward, he packed his meager belongings in a single suitcase. He didn't have a grand plan for the future. He only knew he couldn't keep living under false identities, not after what happened. The night before he intended to leave the city, he sat at his cluttered table, a small lamp illuminating the suit. He was almost tempted to burn it, to rid himself of the temptation forever. Just as he was about to fold it away one last time, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. His heart pounded as he answered. Charlotte's voice came through, hesitant and full of quiet tension. "I read your letter," he swallowed. "Charlotte," she cut him off. "Let me speak first. I'm furious at you. I feel humiliated and manipulated. But the part that confuses me is that you didn't go through with the heist. You saved that necklace at the gala, and something in me keeps wondering why." He closed his eyes, barely daring to breathe. "Because I couldn't stand the idea of hurting you, or letting you down." She was silent on the other end, perhaps weighing his words. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she finally said, her voice trembling. But I had to call. I had to hear your voice for myself. This was all so unreal. His grip tightened around the phone. I understand, he whispered. I'm leaving the city. I can't stay here knowing what I did. Another pause. I can't tell you what to do, she said quietly. Part of me wishes I'd never met you, that you never walked into my life with all these lies. But another part... She trailed off, her voice catching. I don't know. Maybe it's best if you go. Maybe we're both better off without this hanging over us. Daniel's eyes stung with tears he wasn't used to shedding. I'm so sorry, he said again, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. I never wanted to hurt you. A shaky exhale came through the line. Well, you did, she replied. And right now, I don't see a way around that. She ended the call. He sat there, phone clutched in his hand, staring at the suit lying on the table. It felt like a relic from a life he no longer wanted, yet he had no idea how to move forward. In the quiet that followed, he realized there were no easy resolutions, no immediate redemption. He packed up the suit, stowed it at the bottom of a duffel bag, and stood by the window. Morning light filtered through the blinds, illuminating the cluttered room and dust particles swirling in the air. Daniel took one last, long look at the place he had called home for the past few years. Then he grabbed his suitcase, picked up his keys, and walked out the door. He didn't have a plan for where he was headed. All he knew was that everything had changed. The illusions he'd built around himself had shattered in the face of one impossible choice. And now he would have to live with that reality, one step at a time. He glanced back at the building as he stepped onto the street. Somewhere inside it was the life he once led, a life of cons, heists, and elaborate facades. Now he felt unmoored, forced to confront the consequences of wanting something more. He tightened his grip on the suitcase and disappeared into the early morning bustle of the city, unsure if he would ever see Charlotte again, but certain that he could no longer be the person he was before. And so, he walked onward, leaving behind not just a disguise, but an old way of living that could never be the same again.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.